Carmine apiece. Good to see you, buddy.
Hey, good to see you.
So what's going on, man? I was just saying before you came on the air, every time I see you, got something else cooking. You always look great, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
And you're always got something happening. You're managing a band, putting a record out from one of your old bands, putting a live thing out. You always got so much going on.
I'm in the record business.
You're fully into it
Music
now.
business.
Yeah. So what's the latest?
Well, the latest is I've been pushing my Guitar Zeus record that I did in the 90s, and I got some new tracks on there. And we've been really, really pushing that hard. We got videos out, lyric videos with Yngwie and Doug Pinnick and Bumblefoot. And there's 32 tracks on Spotify and 32 tracks on iTunes, which I understand is not going to be doing downloads anymore.
Yeah, well, they're changing the whole way it works, apparently.
Yeah,
it's just they're breaking out the different things. Ed knew more about this last week because we had some people
They're not
calling.
getting rid of... You can still purchase music via
Oh, you
iTunes.
could?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
You can.
Because, I still do that, myself. And so we've been pushing that. And the Guitar Zeus thing, a lot of people that are hearing it are loving it.
Well, explain the history of that, because you said the record originally came out in the 90s. So
Right.
talk about the history of what it was and what it is now.
Okay. What it was released in 1995 and 1997 worldwide, everywhere but America. As you know, in those years, it was sort of like grunge.
Yeah,
Guys
tough.
like me and Blue Murder and King Cobra and all that was like has-beens. So... but this has sort of like a Soundgarden, Blue Murder meets the Beatles kind of vibe. And I came up with the idea to do it as a solo record, bring in friends of mine to play lead guitar. So I brought in like Brian May, Ted Nugent, Yngwie, Slash.
Huge names.
Richie Sambora, Steve Morse. I can't remember them half the time. Dweezil Zappa, Nelly Sean. And when we did it in the mid-90s, nobody was working. Everybody was like out of band. Slash wasn't in Guns N' Roses. Dweezil Zappa was just Frank's son. And now everybody's like doing fairly good.
Right.
So I wanted to release it as a catalog item in America. So it never got released here properly. And my friend from Primary Wave, Robert DePold, he said,
Sure.
You should keep the digital rights because eventually the downloads are going to go away, and that the digital rights are going to be worth more than anything.
Because you're talking streaming.
Streaming,
right.
Yeah. So I said, okay. So I found one track that was never, ever released and another track that was never released anywhere but in Japan. So the Japanese one was John Norum from Europe, a track called Nothing.
From the band Europe.
The band Europe.
Right.
And then... this track I found called Mother Space had a 24-track tape. I bounced it to Pro Tools. I found out it had everything on it except a lead guitar. So I asked my buddy Bumblefoot if he'd play on it, and he did. And he did a great job. And so that became the lead video, lyric video.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had that. And I had done a Guitar Zeus Japan and a Guitar Zeus Korea, which is Japanese and Korean artists. And so I had one of each of those on tracks that were never released here either.
Well, you did a full record of Guitar Zeus in those those countries?
Yes.
You know enough musicians there to make a record with them?
I did in the 90s. I spent a lot of time in the 90s there because me and Tony Franklin were in a band called Pearl, which is half Japanese and half American and English.
Well, I didn't know that.
So we used to go to Japan all through the 90s, and we'd stay there for 2 or 3 months at a time.
Really?
Yeah, we knew all the guys like the Bees and all these big groups that were there. And I got them all to play on. I didn't get Tack from the Bees, but I got all these other big Japanese guys. And it did well over there. The Japanese version did well, hit the charts. And
now, the music on these records, this is covers or of other things? It's all original music
stuff.
Did you write the music?
Yep. Me and Kelly Keeling. Kelly Keeling was in Blue Murder on the second album.
Right. Sang that one track.
Yeah. And what a track he sang.
Yeah, On Fire.
On Fire. It's incredible. So we went to Japan when John Sykes was going to Japan with his version of Blue Murder. When the second album came out, it was big in Japan. It had me and Tony on most of it. So we went to Japan as a super session. And I had done that in the 80s, so this was volume 2. And it was Kelly, me, Tony, and Mitch Perry. Okay, so that's when I got to meet Kelly, and he started showing me his songs. And that's when I was coming up with the Guitar Zeus thing. So I said, Kelly, you want to put together this album with me? And he said, yeah. So I got Tony to play on it. So because I loved Tony's bass playing in Blue Murder, I loved playing with Tony. So that's why it came together like that, you know. So we got Kelly on it, and the plan was to get Brian May first, Ted Nugent second, and the guys from King's X, because I thought everybody loved Brian May. All the guitar players loved Brian.
Still do, yeah.
Everyone loved Ted Nugent back in the day, and everyone loved King's X. So if I can get those guys on first, so while I was looking for the record deal, I contacted these guys just by chance. I ran into Ted somewhere. I ran into Brian somewhere. I said, hey, if I do this record, will you play on it? I said, yeah. So once I got the deal, I had Brian and Ted and King's X on there first.
And by King's X, you had Ty?
I got Ty and I got Doug.
Oh, both played, okay.
Yeah, so Doug sings on the track. Now, when I did, Yngwie heard about it, and he wanted to be on it, right? So he wanted to be on the track with Doug singing. So I hooked that up. And then when I talked to Mick Mars about doing it, I had Edgar Winter singing the track. He said, I want to be on the track with Edgar Winter.
Right, these guys want to play with the guys.
So I hooked up Edgar Winter. So those are the only two lead vocalists on the whole record. Kelly Keeling sings all the rest, does an amazing job. The songs are great. They're really as good as the Blue Murder songs, I consider, you know.
So this thing came out 20 years ago, but not in America.
Not in America.
And so you basically did a revamped version of it that is now in America. Right. Now, is there a physical release of it?
Yes, I did a physical release on my Rocker Records. Not all of them. I took 12 of the best tracks for the CD, and we have a single vinyl with 8 tracks.
Okay, and is that out now?
That's out now. You can get it on merchnow.com. You can get it on Amazon, most of the platforms where you buy physical.
Right. But and if people want to hear it as a streaming, it's on all the streaming services?
All the streaming services.
That's interesting, man, that never came out here. I mean, you got some major players on there, some major names. And then, of course, you're playing all the drums, I'm assuming.
I'm playing all the drums. Some of the best drum sounds with me and Tony, and just progressive, really cool progressive music. It's not like run-of-the-mill kind of rock tracks. They're very progressive.
Now, let me ask you this. You're saying that this stuff was recorded around 95, right? So I'm trying to remember my timeline here because my timelines are always awful. But to make a record like what you're talking about now with all these different musicians would be very easy because people can just email tracks to each other now. You can be anywhere in the world and put a record together. I just got the tracks in, whatever. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in 95 you weren't able to do that yet, were you?
No.
So were these people actually all in the same place ever? How did you do it?
What we had to do was to Brian May, I actually sent him a copy of the Master 24 track. Steve Morse, same thing. Ted Nugent, Yngwie, and the guys from King's X, I physically carried on a plane the 24 track and went into the studio with them. Recorded them. That was like a slave, we called it.
Yeah.
And brought it back, and then we bounced from one 24 to the other 24. All right. Brian,
so it was all pre-digital.
Yes, and then we started using ADATs, which were VHS size tapes.
Right.
And I sent that to Paul Gilbert and maybe one or two other guys, and had ADATs in the house. But the rest of the guys that I didn't send the 24 track to, I'll go get them physically, all did it in L.A., like Mick Mars, Elliot Easton, Bob Daisley, he's the only other bass player, Neil Sean, Slash, a few of the other guys. I have Steven Seagal and John McEnroe playing on the album.
Really?
They were done in the studio in L.A. That was Guitar Zeus too, like Richie Sambora in the studio. So a few of those guys for Guitar Zeus too, I had sent out stuff. But the funny thing is, when we were doing Guitar Zeus Japan, I was recording, the album, the tracks, and I was going to Japan to get all the guitar players. So the engineer, who's now the bass player in Yes,
Billy Sherwood?
Billy Sherwood's his studio. He looked at me and said, well, here's the 24 tracks you'd have to take. There were 3 big 24 tracks that are heavy. He said, or you can have this ADAT, put it in your pocket. I said, you know what? I'll take the ADAT. So I took the ADAT with the master mixes on there and took it to Japan and did it like that.
Wow. Amazing. Do you miss you're a guy, you've been in the business decades, started in the 60s. I mean, it's just, you've done every version of recording you could do, yes. Every possible way you've made records or recorded. Do you miss the old days of recording? Do you miss the way it was going into the big studios?
I still do it.
You do?
I still do analog.
Do you still go and book a studio and go into a big live room?
Well, it don't have to be that big anymore. The studio's around, like one in New Jersey called TKL, which has a nice sized room. They have analog. You know, there's another one that we record all the Cactus stuff, Electric Randy Land, we call it. And they have a really good Pro Tools setup, but I send it to my guy who mixed all his new guitar, Zeus and the Peace Brothers, and my Kodiak band that just came out. I sent you a track. I don't know if you got it on your...
Oh, I haven't had a chance to look at my phone. I've been going nonstop here, but...
Yeah. So he has a big Neve board, and he's got 24-track machines, so anything we mix now goes through, even if we record it on digital, we bounce it right into each track, into the 24-track. And then bounce it back, and it gives it that analog sound.
Interesting. But do you of all the studio, you've worked in every studio imaginable, I would think, around the world. Did you have a favorite?
I did have a favorite. I really like Cherokee in L.A.
In L.A.? Yeah,
because it had a big Trident board. We did all the Rod Stewart stuff there with Andy Jones. You know, and me and Andy created a really cool drum sound in that place, in which I still use today, the miking techniques that he showed me.
Yeah. Andy died, what was it, 2-3 years ago, maybe something like that, right?
Yeah, that was weird from basically alcohol.
Yeah. I didn't know him well, but I mean, for people that don't know, he was one of the legends in terms of producing and engineering and did Zeppelin records as an engineer, did everything.
All the Rod records that I worked on.
He did.
Yeah. All the Hot Legs and Passion and Sexy and all that stuff. I re-recorded Do You Think I'm Sexy with Pat Travers on Guitar Zeus. It's a heavy version. It's really, really cool. Very cool.
Everybody should definitely check that out.
Check it out.
So what do you have going on now? Because there's so many things I can talk to you about, but we have another guest coming up in the next hour, so we only have so much time. But
right.
You always have, as I was saying before you came in, if I ran down all your credits, it would take up the whole interview because you've done so many different things and played with so many different people.
Right.
What's going on with you now? Who are you playing with now? What's the focus?
We're doing Vanilla Fudge gigs in the summer with a Legends of Rock tour. Starts in August. I'm doing 2 gigs with my brother next month, and this month, Vanilla Fudge at the Bolton Center on the 29th. But I'm really focused on helping my group. I'm co-managing and producing Kodiak. Mm-hmm. You introduced them at the rock, what's it called, the Heavy Metal Hall of Fame?
Oh, in L.A., at NAMM this year, yeah.
So they just released a new single, which I emailed you. I think you should check it out.
Okay.
You'd like it. They're like a new Van Halen kind of group. They're really young. Guitar player just turned 17, and he's awesome.
He's that good?
He's pretty damn good.
Yeah.
He's pretty damn good. And so we're promoting that. And I'm getting into speaking, doing history of rock kind of speaking gigs.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and me and Vinny are doing that, too. We're doing, like, our history of rock together. Like in Tucson, we're doing a rock history gig where the moderators are going to ask us questions about our career like we're doing now. And then we're going to do a Q&A with the audience and then play a couple of songs.
Oh, all right. Nice. Yeah. Have you done those yet?
We did one at NAMM, and it went really great.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so now we decided we're going to do some of those. I have a speaking gig up coming up in Lake George, I think, near Lake George, New York.
Okay.
And another one in Connecticut in November. History of Rock, where Leslie, my girlfriend, is the moderator, and we talk about, my beginning of the career with Vanilla Fudge and what we listened to, what influenced us, what was going on in rock history then, like Hendrix, and then we move on to Led Zeppelin, how we took them on tour, and all the stories that go along with it, the Beatles and how that influenced Vanilla Fudge, stories about the Beatles, and it goes on, and on and on. Then we do Q&A, and then I play a little drums.
Is there any other? Where you're doing these mostly in clubs, I would imagine, right, or theaters?
No, one is a club. And one is the theater.
And is there live music before or after you, like other bands too? Do the promoters do that?
No.
Well, that's good because I do those too.
You do?
Yeah, I've done them for a few years, here and there, on and off, when I have the time and the opportunity.
Right.
And I haven't done them in a couple of years, but I got 3 of them coming up. I'm doing Wisconsin, New Jersey, and I think
where are you doing
Massachusetts. Clubs. They're rock clubs mainly. Yeah, I've done them before.
And you just talk about the music.
I just talk. I do what I do.
We should do it together.
Yeah. Well, what I do is I just see, it's different because you're coming from a perspective where you actually did this stuff. You lived it. You were in all these bands. I'm coming at it from the perspective of being the guy that delivered it or talked to them or listened to it or tell the stories about dealing with these guys.
My history goes further back.
Way back, yeah.
And I'm talking about Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles, Revolver, and meeting them. And like when our first album came out, George Harrison used to carry the Vanilla Fudge album around to parties.
That's amazing.
He loved it.
That's amazing.
It's just so we go back to all that stuff, and then I do Q&A as well.
Yeah, and then I end by doing Stump the Trunk like I did on the TV show, where people ask me the questions and I give them the prizes. But the reason I ask you about the bands is because a lot of times the promoters, you know how the promoters are. They want to put on 2-3 local bands opening and then bands after you. And then by the time you get out there and you talk to the audience, they just got pounded by 3 bands.
I tell you what I do,
and they're drained.
What I do to work gigs with my Kodiak band, like I'm doing one in Connecticut. It's a club called Trilogy. I did a master class there, and that's how I found them. And I did it at the Cutting Room when we did a promo. I go on for a half hour and talk about how I put the Guitar Zeus album together. Mm-hmm. And we play the Guitar Zeus album before. I talk about that, Q&A, and then I bring them on. And Kodiak goes up and plays like 30, 40 minutes. Mm-hmm. It's a nice little package.
Yeah, for sure.